Hello everyone. Welcome to the second section on green infrastructure financing. Now, in the first sections, right, we looked at the why of it, right, as to why is it important, and then we looked at case studies. But in the second section, right, we'll be looking at some of the financing mechanisms. Now, there are many, right, but we'll be focusing on some of them. And we have also, we are also kind of dealing with the biodiversity aspect because this is a new area, right, which has been introduced into the broad infrastructure financing mechanism, right? As you saw in the last example, right, whereby the European view of it is having a city or having an urban infrastructure which exists with nature, right, and which includes by definition the broad biodiversity also. And this is a fairly new area, right? So the paper that we are going to refer for this specific for these specific topics, right, which is particularly pertaining to biodiversity, is one of your required readings, right? And the title of the paper is Do Investors Care About Biodiversity, right? So uh, how do we define biodiversity? Now, biodiversity is an ecological term, and sometimes it is confused with natural capital, which is often used as an economic term to emphasize the role of nature in supporting economic activity and well-being. Biodiversity is the variety of all living organisms in all habitats, and the thing is, right, that it is deteriorating at an unprecedented pace. Between 1970 and 2018, the world has seen say 69% loss or close to 70% loss of monitored wildlife, right, which is based on the WWF report of 2022. Biodiversity integrity has been identified as one of the most overstepped planetary boundaries. Now, the idea, right, is that because we do not see an immediate economic benefit out of it, right, therefore, there is no identification of biodiversity as something that should be preserved. So a lot of times, humans have exploited these resources without actually realizing what the downside to it is. And one of the planetary boundaries, right, is basically to do with a tipping point which, if crossed, right, then there is no reversal back from that specific region. Biodiversity collapse jeopardizes all the goods, services that human obtains from this ecosystem with potentially far-reaching economic applications, right? So it is not just the death of these animals, right? It is not that these animals are, going to provide us with meat in particular, right? Because they're not farmed animals. But the fact is, right, that the collapse of these species, right, has a much wider economic implication. For example, tourism is lost in a specific region, you kind of disrupt the entire natural ecosystem that exists, right? Thereby causing a disbalance. It can lead to outbreaks, it can lead to diseases. So there are loads of things. The fact that you have these trees, they act as natural barriers in many of these instances against these natural climate disasters that are arising. So a lot of the world's economic output, right, depends on this ecosystem without people realizing as to how important this ecosystem is. So what are the kinds of benefits, economic benefits, that we can derive from it? So obviously, nature provides us all the essential inputs for human life, health, prosperity, both now and in future. The widespread destruction, including that of the natural habitats from the expansion of crops, pastures, managed forests, infrastructure, and urbanization, has led to a huge loss, right? So what are the kinds of benefits that they provide? If they provide any kind of benefits, then they're called as ecosystem services. So we have provisions for material goods, which is food, fiber, fuel, and fodder. The non-material is basically us enjoying the nature, which is the recreational aspect, right? We go to a natural reserve, we go to a wildlife sanctuary and enjoy that. And on top of that, they act as massive carbon sinks. We've already seen in the New York Catskill case study mountain, right, that an entire urban infrastructure pertaining to water was saved just by preserving this Catskill mountain at a cost, which was close to 2 to 3% of what would have been a cost if we had invested in a man-made infrastructure. The point is, right, that if we lead to, or if there is a widespread damage of these kinds of infrastructure, right, then this leads to an irreversible damage to the ecosystem. And once you cross that tipping point, right, there is no coming back to that, to coming back to that natural state. So what this paper does is, right, this paper actually uses the Paris Accord kind of concept, which is the 2015 concept, right? So before this, do investors actually care about biodiversity, right? Which means that if there is no regulation, if there is no commitment by the countries, right, then do I actually care about it in the first instance? So what this paper tries to do is, right, they try to look at this from three fifth from from three perspectives, right? So they look at it from the conferences of parties, which is the COP, called the COP summit. Now in 2015, right, in the Paris Accord, what it was agreed is that will limit the rise of the global temperatures up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But there was nothing which was majorly said about biodiversity. It is only in the coming and the Montreal summit, right, whereby we had a commitment for biodiversity. So the idea is, right, that maybe before this investors did not care and now they start caring about it. So what were the kind of policies that existed, in the period prior to the Montreal and the coming summit? So one we had is, in 1980, for the first time, right, we had a world conservation strategy, in which biodiversity was introduced as a concept. Then in 1992, we had the UN Convention on biological diversity, and this is when it entered into the force. And post that, many of these COPs have taken into place, but none of them have achieved their desired targets. One thing is of importance is that US did sign it, but they did not ratify it. And there have been multiple other instances of corporate and public collaborations, which includes task force on nature related financial disclosures. So basically you are kind of nudging the companies to disclose the kind of resources that they're using and the kind of harm. We also had the science based target initiatives, and basically you have had a lot going, but nothing which was just biodiversity related regulation, which was kind of enforceable. But definitely there was a framework which was existing, or there was some kind of a force which was coming together, which would lead to then some kind of some kind of existment of or existing of a regulatory framework. Now then, in the European Union in 2018, right, you had an action plan on financing sustainable growth, establishment of the taxonomy. So, there were some regulations which were moving towards that direction, which is the SFDR, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, Principal Adverse Impact Indicators. Then you had this do no significant principal harm, right, which means that you had to look at an investment from the point of view that did it become exploitative, did it become something which is damaging to the society, to the environment. Then in France, there was an Article 29 on, law on energy and climate, which required financial institutions to disclose their biodiversity risks. And in United States, right, this is just before the coming and the Montreal Protocol, that in 2021 there was an executive order on protecting public health and environment. Then in June 2021, you had the marine ecosystem, which was strengthened, and there was also resentment of some of those strategies which had made it easier for for to remove the species, basically, because if you remove a species from an endangered list, then there is less money that is going towards the conservation of those species. So then you have the Kunming Declaration and Montreal Agreement. Now what would we have in this? Now this was the first time, right, that there was a proper framework, and this is what the authors try to exploit, right? So if people start caring, or if the countries start caring, then going forward from this specific position, right, they should actually penalize or start penalizing companies which are actually causing damage to biodiversity. The same thing that happened in post the 2015 Paris Accord. So there was a call for urgent action to protect biodiversity. It emphasized on biodiversity's importance for human health. We still don't understand a lot of the interaction of the kinds of diseases that spreads from humans to animals and animals to humans, right? So we definitely know that there is some kind of a barrier, and we should not break that barrier. Highlights the need to eliminate harmful subsidies and incentives, which kind of destroys the biodiversity. Then in Article 13 of that, right, there was a stress in alignment of the financial flows, which would actually promote biodiversity conservation. So conservation. So this was the first one, right? That this was compared to kind of the Paris Agreement, because Paris Agreement was the first time, right, that countries became extremely serious, and it forced a lot of the companies to actually act in a certain way. Then in the Montreal Agreement, right, which was it included, some kind of a target-based approach, right? So key areas were identified, and what was one of the things that was promulgated in that is that at least protect 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030. It reaffirms the alignment of public-private activities and financial flows towards the biodiversity protection, and it also basically allows for building up of institutions in this specific space. So what happened post COP15? There was an establishment of the Network for Greening the Financial Institution, which is the NGFS, which is housed at Banque de France. And what it does is it is a body of multiple central banking institutions, right, over 125, and they for the first time, included the transition risks and the risks of the nature related risk, that could actually permeate into the financial ecosystem. And it recognized, for the first time, as to how this is important for the central banks in general. Then you had the task force on nature related financial disclosures, which was again in agreement with Montreal Agreement, and many recommendations, were agreed upon for this specific framework. There were major recommendations which were made, basically, the governance, which is, how to strengthen the organization's governance for the nature related disclosures. Then you had the strategy, which is disclosure on the effects of business model strategy and financial planning. And then you had the risk and impact management, which is description of processes for identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and monitoring of these risk-based targets. Metrics and targets, again, you had the construction of a specific framework through which these disclosures could be made, same like you had it for SFDR, for example. We also had the establishment of the International Sustainability Standard Boards, established under the 2021-2022 IFRS Foundation, and it identified biodiversity, ecosystem, and ecosystem services as potential projects. High seas treaties were signed, which were there to protect the marine biodiversity ecosystem, and included as to the kinds of penalties that could be there when it came to pollution and dispute resolution mechanisms, specifically pertaining to the oceans and the fisheries as an industry. The EU 2030 biodiversity proposed for nature restoration laws, guidelines on forests, soil health, and the monitoring for these framework. And actually, one of the required readings of this actually discusses in the policy discussion section, right, as to what the EU policy is. And if you will notice, right, that it actually describes the infrastructure in conjunction with nature, right? So this makes it quite relevant for us. And then you had the EU CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which made it mandatory for investors to kind of talk about the biodiversity disclosure requirements for some companies. Again, the idea would be to extend the ambit and allow for better disclosure so that investors can understand the kind of risks that are associated. Again, this will form as a major benchmark that we'll be using to understand as to what is going to happen with the with how investors behave. So this is what the paper tries to do, and this is what we'll be looking forward.